It took 6 officers, a ladder truck, and one very confused K-9 unit to breach my backyard. All because Margaret Fitzgerald called 911. Not for a break-in, not for a fire, not even for a loose raccoon, though that happened once in our neighborhood, and his name was apparently Chester. No, she called the cops because I was, quote, constructing a fortified structure in plain view of the community. Which, as one bewildered sergeant confirmed, turned out to be my backyard shed. Except now that shed had barbed wire, a motion sensor turret, and a keypad-locked blast door. Margaret had escalated, and I had responded in kind. Let me back up a few months. My name is David Harper, and I moved into Cypress Ridge Estates for peace and quiet. As a retired electrical engineer in my early 50s, I enjoyed documentary marathons, grilling on weekends, and building things that required blueprints and proper permits. Enter Margaret Fitzgerald, HOA president, self-appointed gatekeeper, and multi-time recipient of the Best Lawn Medallion. Margaret was in her late 60s, wore pastel blazers like armor, and once fined a neighbor for having what she called a visually disruptive garden gnome. Her pride and joy was the HOA rule book, 273 pages, laminated, alphabetized, cross-referenced with county codes she had memorized like scripture. She noticed me the moment I rolled in a delivery labeled, modular steel panels and infrared camera array. She marched over with the determination of someone who had just spotted a crime against suburban aesthetics. She asked, with clipped suspicion, what I was building back there. I smiled and told her it was a shed. She narrowed her eyes and said there was no such thing as, just a shed. That should have been my first warning, but I was naive then, believing in things like property rights and common sense. The citations came faster than overnight delivery packages. Unapproved architectural alteration. Structure exceeds allotment of mystery. Unauthorized reflective surfaces. Excessive hammering outside of Zen hours, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Fence line implication of militarization. I tried being reasonable and submitted plans for review like a rule-abiding citizen. Margaret responded with a rejection letter that included a hand-drawn diagram of what she called a suggested community-friendly gnome hut alternative. The drawing looked like it was done by someone who had never seen an actual structure but had strong opinions about them. Anyway, when that failed to deter me, Margaret began daily surveillance. She would lean over my fence with opera binoculars, the expensive kind with mother-of-pearl handles. She recorded the sound of my power tools and claimed they, quote, echoed with aggressive intent. At one point, she left a note reading, "This is a neighborhood, not a NORAD facility." I continued to ignore her, which in retrospect was like ignoring a wasp building a nest on your porch. Eventually, you are going to get stung. Margaret escalated by calling what she termed the emergency HOA hotline, which confusingly was just a landline with a label maker sticker reading, Command Center. When that didn't produce the desired results, she called 911. She actually told the dispatcher that I was constructing what appeared to be a military installation in violation of residential zoning laws and possibly the Geneva Convention. The dispatcher, bless their patient soul, asked if there were any actual weapons involved. Margaret replied that the structure itself was weapon-adjacent. When the police arrived that Tuesday afternoon, they expected to find a drug lab or a bunker full of illegal weapons. What they found was me grilling ribeye steaks next to what admittedly looked like a miniature Pentagon. The shed had evolved. I'll admit that it now featured a metal shell, reinforced locks, solar panels, and a ventilation system that could survive a Category 3 hurricane. Inside were my tools, fishing rods, lawn fertilizer, and a temperature-controlled bourbon shelf that I was particularly proud of. Margaret was pacing the sidewalk in pearls and fury, shouting that my structure was in violation of the Geneva Convention. I calmly handed over the shed blueprints to Officer Daniels. Everything was within code. Even the barbed wire was ornamental plastic from a Halloween store that I had installed as a joke after her 15th complaint. Officer Daniels turned to Margaret and asked if she really told dispatch I had a surface-to-air defense mechanism. Margaret huffed and said it looked missile-adjacent. Daniels rolled his eyes and informed her that wasting police resources was a crime. But Margaret was not done. She filed an emergency HOA injunction complete with color-coded violation tabs and screenshots of my Amazon orders that she had somehow obtained. Unfortunately for her, the county clerk was my niece Sandra, who recognized the absurdity immediately and forwarded the complaint to the HOA Oversight Committee with a note about potential harassment. Meanwhile, I decided to have some fun and installed mirrors on the shed roof angled to reflect sunlight directly into Margaret's prized rose garden during her afternoon tea time. She retaliated by hiring a local contractor to erect what she called a privacy screen, which turned out to be 3 inches over the legal height limit. I reported her to the same HOA board she controlled. The board, terrified of legal liability, fined her $150. 2 days later, her screen mysteriously collapsed in what the weather report called a strong breeze. I was inside watching a documentary about structural engineering failures at the time, with 3 neighbors as witnesses. The war continued for weeks. She hired a private investigator to photograph my shed from a drone. I installed a flagpole with an American flag that happened to cast a shadow on her kitchen window every morning. She complained to the Postal Service that my mailbox was 2 degrees off regulation angle. I reported her lawn for being 1/16th of an inch over regulation height during the drought restriction period. She tried to organize a neighborhood petition, but most neighbors were tired of her reign of terror and signed a counter-petition supporting my right to build a shed. Then came the monthly HOA meeting, packed with popcorn-munching neighbors who had cleared their Thursday night schedules for this exact moment. I had prepared something special, my piece de resistance, as the French would say. I stood up during the public comment period and announced I had security footage to share regarding trespassing on my property. The room went silent except for the sound of Margaret dropping her gavel. I hit play on my laptop, connected to the community center projector. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., 3 nights prior. There was Margaret, scaling my fence in a bathrobe and sneakers, armed with a tape measure and what looked like a Geiger counter. She was whispering into a walkie-talkie, saying, "Operation Shed is go. Eagle 1 is entering the perimeter." She made it halfway over before losing her grip and falling directly into my new koi pond with a splash that sent my expensive Japanese fish into a panic. The room erupted in laughter. Margaret was stammering about conducting a safety inspection for the good of the community, but the footage continued. It showed her climbing out of the pond, dripping wet, then trying to measure my shed while her bathrobe kept getting caught on my decorative garden stakes. She tripped over my garden hose, knocked over my bird bath, and finally gave up when my motion-activated sprinklers turned on, sending her scrambling back over the fence like a wet cat. The board president. Not Margaret, but the actual elected president, Robert Chin, who she had been undermining for months, called for an immediate vote. By unanimous decision, Margaret was stripped of her HOA committee positions, banned from enforcing any codes for 5 years, and required to attend a civility and boundaries training course at the community center. But that was not the end of it. The county prosecutor, who had been copied on my niece's report, decided to charge Margaret with trespassing, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The trespassing was a misdemeanor, but the harassment charge was enhanced due to the pattern of behavior, and the misuse of emergency services for falsely reporting a military installation was a felony in our state. She was looking at potential jail time and massive fines. At her arraignment the following month, Margaret stood before Judge Patricia Blackwell, who happened to live 3 blocks away and had received her own share of HOA citations from Margaret over the years. The judge was not amused. Margaret was convicted on all counts. The harassment charge got her 200 hours of community service, specifically doing yard work for elderly residents who couldn't maintain their properties to HOA standards. The trespassing resulted in a $2,000 fine, but the misuse of emergency services was the real kicker, a $10,000 fine and 2 years probation. Margaret's face went from red to purple to a shade of white I'd only seen on medical charts. She actually fainted right there in the courtroom, collapsing onto her attorney, who barely managed to catch her before she hit the floor.